You're watching Amhara Media Corporation English Service Messenger program. Today, Messenger asks the question, is the U.S. policy towards Ethiopia the part of the problem or the part of the solution, or is it something in between when it comes to the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia? To answer this very important question, I have a special guest today. My guest is a renowned peace and security scholar and researcher, Professor Anne Fitzgerald. I meet Professor Anne Fitzgerald at the sidelines of the 10th anniversary of Tana High Level Forum in Bahar Dar, Ethiopia. I'm Yohannes Ljadem. Stay tuned. It's great to have you at the sidelines of the 10th anniversary of Tana Forum. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
In this forum, we talked about just African solutions for African problems. This is the ideal scenario that we are talking about. But practically on the ground, foreign superpowers' policy towards Africa is very powerful and it's impactful. And one of them is the U.S. policy towards Ethiopia and the northern conflict particularly. How do you assess its policy and its impact on the ground?
As you know, we've been in the Tana Forum for the last couple of days talking about peace and security challenges on the continent, and the good news is that we've had many members, non-African actors, external actors involved as well. So it's a really good opportunity to hear African voices and the voices of Ethiopians and representatives in the Horn of Africa. I think the conflict in northern Ethiopia is a conflation of many issues coming together. There's no doubt that the United States is a big actor in commenting on the conflict and has been from day one. The United States has also contributed some very important humanitarian assistance and aid throughout the conflict period as well. I think one of the big questions is, could this conflict have been managed a different way by external actors? Could it have been commented on in a slightly different way? And that's what a lot of questions over the last few days have alluded to on the margins and on the sidelines. I think a number of external actors, the United States included, took quite clear and absolute positions at the very beginning of the conflict. And sometimes it's very difficult for external actors to change positions, and instead their approach morphs over time. And I think that's what we've seen with a number of actors. Is it the reason for the conflict and the reason for the destruction, which was your question? No, I don't believe it is. I think the reason for the conflict and the destruction is primarily because an aggrieved, disposed member of the former coalition is unhappy with the way the governance of the country is going, and made a decision to coordinate an unprovoked attack on the state, which led to this prolonged insurgency conflict. And one of the difficulties throughout the conflict for the outside world has been in terms of getting good, accurate, effective analysis and hearing from all the voices involved in the conflict. And I think I would ask two questions. I would ask, one, in gathering the evidence and informed analysis on what is really happening on the ground, have external actors, the United States included, done everything they possibly can to hear from all relevant stakeholder groups, including ordinary Tigrayans. Tigrayans currently being housed in the IDP camps and being protected in some of these IDP camps? Or is the mainstay of the evidence and the voices being heard to inform the analysis of external actors coming from those with ethnic Ethiopian background living outside of the country, and the leadership in the region of Tigray. The second question I would ask is, do external actors have a plan B? Plan A, in my view, has not worked. The assumption that by issuing punitive measures to two parties in the conflict and not the third party in the conflict, there would be a gradual nearing of a peace process and a successful peace process has been a flawed assumption. And you know, putting a little bit more force, possibly by the way of sanctions and the threat even of punitive measures on the third party, to say to them, look, it's now or never, this is a chance for peace. If you're not going to pursue it, then we have to pursue other options. That kind of clarity is not coming out in the dialogue. Instead, we're lingering, we're seeing an AU, what's supposed to be an AU-led peace process being questioned in terms of logistical challenges, being questioned in terms of the roles and responsibilities for people involved in it. And I think this must be an African-led process, and it must be led by the AU and also the state of Ethiopia. And I think if the African Union cannot lead on a peace process like this, as it has done in the past on peace processes, then you know, the continent's in trouble. And I don't think blame should be put on the shoulders of the African Union, because a peace process will never work if the overall objectives of each of the parties involved in the peace talks are not similar, broadly similar. So I think there are hard questions that need to be asked. One, are both parties really committed to the same objectives of peace? Two, is there a plan B that members of the external international community are contemplating right now and hopefully will push for? And three, could this conflict have ended a long time ago?
The Biden administration has clearly outlined two important foreign policy directions. One is human rights and the other is democracy. And many critics are saying that the Biden administration is not listening to the will of the majority of the Ethiopian people when it comes to electing their own government. And at the same time, the second is human rights. And the Biden administration singled out the humanitarian situation only in Tigray. And we have heard atrocities on a grand scale, massacres here and there in Afar and Amhara. And the Biden administration, despite the knowledge of all these atrocities, they seem to be focused solely on Tigray. Can that bring us to the situation that can create peace and stability? And is that a really and genuine criticism on your part?
Well, let me start by talking about human rights and democracy, which are very important, you know, pillars of the democratic institutions and the commons. Democracy and human rights have to be inclusive concepts and not be applied or understood selectively. Now, I don't think anybody's trying to understand or project them selectively, but the sentiment on the ground and the perceptions on the ground, certainly to many hundreds of people I spoke to in different regions of Ethiopia, is that there is selectivism happening here. The conflict is not a conflict in Tigray. In fact, the majority of the battle space and the battles were staged and orchestrated outside of Tigray in both Amhara and Afar regions. And let's not forget the hybrid effects of this conflict, which have been played out in Benishangul, in Gambela, and Oromia as well. So it's certainly not a Tigray conflict, and it's not only sending the wrong messages to the world about this conflict, but it's also creating space for negative perceptions and resentment to develop from the communities that are deeply affected, but not discussed very much. And I think I would just urge external actors to pay particular attention to the statements that are made, the official statements that are made on Twitter and other forms of social media, to really, communicate the reality on the ground. Yes, Tigray is sitting a little bit differently than the other regions because the state is in control of those other regions at the moment. The state is not permitted, oddly enough, in one of the regions that it has legitimate authority over. But that is an arrangement that was put in place after the first unilateral ceasefire and the withdrawal of the interim administration. And that was an arrangement that came by way of pressure on the Ethiopian government by external actors, including the United States.
Enormous atrocities committed in Afar and Amhara region. The Biden administration, even President Biden himself, singled out the situation only in Tigray. And could that bring us to peace and stability in this country?
Your Tigrayan brothers and sisters who I engaged with in the Jara IDP camps in Shifre, in Afar, all they want is to be living peacefully with the Ethiopian brothers and sisters more generally. So rest assured, that's the voice of the ordinary people. And now I've remembered what I was going to say in my third point, which was, we see the analysis at the moment dominated by voices that comprise of the TPLF leadership by way of major media platforms that interview them, also by the global diaspora. But is the voice of ordinary Tigrayan people really being taken into consideration here? Those voices that have that permissive environment to really speak out in. And I would question that. And I would also question how many people have traveled to these areas where they can access that voice in the same way people like myself did. So I think, look, there's one option for peace. There's an opportunity. Our party's going to take up that opportunity. If that opportunity is not availed of and taken up, a state whose primary function is to protect its sovereignty, its people, including your ethnic Tigrayan brothers and sisters, and its borders and security, needs to pursue other measures. That sort of suggests that the onus is on external actors and parties to the conflict to do whatever it takes to bring about peace and to silence the arms. But failure to do that cannot let a situation sit indefinitely that is hemorrhaging the population in the Tigrayan region, that is marginalizing them from the rest of their Ethiopian brothers and sisters, and that is grossly unfair and unacceptable in the 21st century.
Who is holding the people of Tigray and its population hostage?
Well, I would argue that the situation as it's been left is holding the people hostage at the moment. There is an assumption in some quarters, based on what I've seen being written by journalists belonging to different major media organizations, that the views being expressed by the TPLF leadership represent the views of the Tigrayan people writ large. And I would challenge that assumption because of the many who I have spoken to and the many who are communicating with me from Tigray, my former students and others, that is not the case. So I think what needs to happen is legitimate opposition parties, because some are not legitimate in Tigray, some did not meet the minimum standards of membership numbers, a submitted mandate. There are rules and regulations that are vested within the electoral authorities here in Ethiopia, and parties, to be considered legitimate parties, need to meet those terms and conditions. So all legitimate parties need to get together with the people and representatives of the people to have a discussion as to what Tigray's position is moving forward in the peace talks. There is a delta between the views that are emerging from ordinary people and the views emerging from TPLF leadership. And I think it's really necessary to broaden the analysis and not to leave this unacceptable situation lingering. Because as it lingers, a state must fulfill its functions to protect its people, its sovereignty, and its security, as well as promoting peace.
Do you believe human rights is as an issue weaponized in the context of Ethiopia?
Well, I don't like using the word weaponize and weaponization because I'm a professor of peace and security and I'm very committed to peace. What I will say is that there's selectivity being applied to discussions on human rights. And I traveled across North Wallo, South Wallo, all across Afar, to the highest northern regions. And there are some very concerning human rights atrocities and human rights abuses that have happened in these areas which are not being discussed in some quarters. Some stakeholders are doing a very good job of discussing them. But you know, methodology in investigations concerns me as well as an academic scholar. Methodologies need to be as representative as possible and as comprehensive as possible. And you know, I feel that the joint investigation team's work that went on in Tigray should have been furthered ages ago to include Amhara and Afar, and also to include other parts of Tigray that had not been reached at the time that initial study had ended. Investigations carried out by human rights organizations also need to be comprehensive as well. So we've seen some studies being carried out on a certain area where there are war graves or mass graves, but in my work in those regions that I've just cited, I've passed many mass graves myself. So it's the level of methodological robustness for some of these investigations, the way things are being published very quickly without coming to completion, and an acceptable level of methodological rigor behind it. So those are the things that concern me about this conflict and which risk setting a different narrative than one that's perhaps a bit more balanced and reflective of the ground-based realities.
There are confirmed reports that Sudan controlled a territory, a land, by displacing farmers, and there is this report of Sudan's involvement in the conflict in one way or another, or by being a venue to transport arms to Tigray, and there seems to be no voice calling out that Sudan, stop, what you are doing is just fueling the conflict. There is no such kind of voice from the US, from the European Union. Why?
Look, I think these are all concerning issues, and it was very good to see His Excellency here at the Tana Forum and with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in bilateral meetings over the last couple of days. It's you know, the regional commitment has really come out here at the Tana Forum by way of representatives who have traveled here. Now, that said, there are many stories and accusations flying around about Eritrea's involvement, Sudan's involvement. I mean, I think you could argue that Sudan was involved very early in this conflict by way of cooperating in, you know, in a military operation right near the border area, and labeling the military joint exercise between Egypt and Sudan as Operation Nile Eagle 1. That's a very controversial, suggestive label, I would say, to put on a military operation as far as the military operations, joint exercises that I am familiar with. Nile Eagle, that's eyes on the Nile, we're watching you type of thing. Just when Ethiopia could have actually used the support of its neighbors. And that's why we're all involved in security cooperative pacts around the world, because countries rely on their neighbors to help in times of need. So yes, that was very unfortunate that Sudan didn't really stand behind Ethiopia as much as it could have, although I think relationships are much better now. The situation with Eritrea is very complicated, of course, because the issue regarding Badme, although it was resolved by an arbitration commission many years ago, that land around Badme has not been officially given back. Even after the peace agreement, it still wasn't given back ceremonially and officially. So people could argue that Eritrea is always in Tigray and has never left Tigray, because that official ceremonial handing back of Badme, even though it's been done on paper and it's been done by way of a Nobel-recognized peace agreement, does not seem to hold. Where we're missing additional evidence is all these numbers that are being suggested by TPLF leaders of Eritrean troops in the region of Tigray. If they are there, let us see the photo evidence, let us know the locations, let us know the numbers, and let's question those authorities back in Asmara on these evidence-based features. But what I'm not seeing is the evidence, just a lot of allegations and suggestions. Now, you know, if this is happening in the numbers that TPLF leaders are suggesting it's happening in, it's concerning. At the same time, Eritrea is a sovereign nation. It needs to protect its sovereignty, security, and its borders as well. And, you know, it shouldn't go unsaid that the TPLF fired missiles very early on in this conflict into Asmara and took out infrastructure in Asmara. And at the time, the Eritrean government didn't respond back. So, you know, there are lots of things that need to be taken into consideration here. I think one of the TPLF's only levers left is to continue what have been described as disinformation and propaganda campaigns to try to make the world respond differently to their needs, because they are not committed, it seems, to a democratic peace and the democratic market reforms and security reforms that Ethiopia is trying to pursue at the moment. And you mentioned earlier on that, you know, there was a democratic election here. There was, you know, almost 80% of the Ethiopian people voted. And just to put some comparative data on that, you know, the Western countries don't have voter turnouts like that. Canada's voter turnout, 63%. America's voter turnout, 67%. Germany's voter turnout, 75%. South Africa's, 57%. Nigeria's 35%. So it was a pretty good voter turnout, particularly when one region couldn't vote. So I'm going to leave the interview there. I hope that gives you some insights on your questions. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Professor. Dear viewers, you're watching The Messenger. This is the end of today's program. I hope you got valuable insights from celebrated peace and security scholar, Professor Ann Fitzgerald. I'm Yohannes Lijalam. Thank you for watching.